Let's unpack this topic of deconversion. Why do people walk away from the Christian faith? And also it's important to examine not just one side of the story, but to look at, well, why do people actually leave atheism or whatever worldview and come to the Christian faith? What are their reasons? So we want to look at this in an even-handed way. So here we are. We want to seize the day. So I've got a number of C's for you to consider. What are the characteristics of deconversion? The causes of, or the cases of deconversion, the causes of deconversion. Caricatures of deconversion, counters to deconversion, and the counterparts of deconversion. People who have come back to the Christian faith or have come to the Christian faith. What are their reasons? So here we go. Let's unpack it. The characteristics of deconversion. In a book on this very topic, we see that it breaks down. We could put it into a 4D perspective. First of all, doubt. Doubt about or denial of the truth of a previously held belief system. And then there is a sense, this disapproval that comes, this moral criticism that comes not just of a particular practice, but also the entire way of life within this system. And then there is this disruption, the emotional upheaval that comes to people who have been brought up in one way of thinking. There's a community, maybe Islam or something like that, and then they end up leaving. Maybe a lot of guilt involved, grief, despair, etc., and then dismissal, where they reject the entirety of the system, but also they end up being rejected by the community to which they had belonged. So there is this fourfold composition of deconversion: the doubt, the disapproval, the disruption, and then the dismissal. Let's look at a few cases of deconversion, those who have come down this pathway. And here's someone, Ed Babinski. He's a Facebook friend. Sometimes when I post something, he'll get on there and try to needle me or whatever. But he's someone who left the Christian faith, and this is how he described his own departure. The arguments that I had used to defend the truth of Christianity were peeled away from me like the many layers of an onion skin. I put up all the intellectual resistance I could and winced at each layer's removal. I suffered through dark nights of the soul, pondering whether my beliefs might not be too narrow or even wholly false. Imperceptibly, my fears, doubts, and grief blossomed into relief, relaxation, and joy. Now he had departed and found, a lot of people say, hey, I found relief in my Christian faith. I found relaxation or peace and joy in my Christian faith. Here he says, I left, and this is what I found. All right, well, that's Ed. Charles Templeton, you may have heard of him, had been a former colleague of Billy Graham's in his crusades, and he wrote this book, Farewell to God. Well, what were his reasons for leaving the Christian faith? Well, he's talked about the suffering of humanity, the problem of evil, which we've begun to address here. He talked about this, the idea of the sensationalism of miracles that just didn't seem to match up with his experience. He talked about miracles being explicable by mass hysteria or psychosomatic explanations. Oh, I really felt like I had this headache, but somebody prayed for me, and it went away, and it's probably just the power of suggestion and so forth, that it's just psychosomatic, it's not real, God really healing you and so forth. The silliness of certain doctrines, like the Trinity, he calls it nonsensical. I'd say, well, there's no contradiction here in the doctrine of the Trinity. Some people may have difficulty explaining the Trinity. By the way, I find it helpful to talk about using the mythological Cerberus as an analogy, a three-headed dog. There is one being, but three centers of awareness of this indivisible being. And so you have threeness with regard to each of these centers of awareness, but yet a oneness in this unbreakable being. And in the same way, in a soulish understanding or in a spiritual understanding, God having three centers of awareness, but being one in being, an indivisible being, a community of love in this in the Godhead. But anyway, that's for another time. But just a little summary in case some of you are wondering, how do I talk about that to my Muslim or Jehovah's Witness friend? Also, the singularity of revelation. We've talked about this, the pluralist challenge. It just seems silly to Templeton to talk about this unique revelation of God in history when, well, what about the rest of humanity? Are they somehow cut off from any sort of hope? So he just found that to be very, very troubling. He also engages in a lot of arguments from outrage. How could you believe in a God? Again, it doesn't really advance the argument. It doesn't make an argument. It just expresses outrage, of course. So you have some of that in his book. John Loftus, another friend of mine, atheist blogger, former pastor, former student of even William Lane Craig, the Christian apologist, philosopher, debater, and so on. John has written some books, and he talks about this outsider test of faith. He says he had been kind of part of this insider faith person where you just listen to the people who talk the same language. You don't have any outside voices speaking into your questions, and so you just kind of become insulated. You grow up in a certain environment, and there is really nothing to give input, to challenge, to offer arguments against what you believe. And so he says that Christians tend to fall into this problem. They don't have any sort of outsider test for faith. What do you do as an outsider? Put yourself in an outsider's shoes and then start to work your way to the Christian faith. He says you're not going to do it. He says if you believe as if you were an outsider, you'll have to assume. There's that science should be the way to go. He says you've got to move in the direction of reason and science. They should guide you rather than what he calls blind faith. Of course, he's caricaturing the position, the idea that faith is somehow opposed to or immune to evidence. He talks about the burden of proof. Assume, he says, your holy book has the burden of proof. Assume human authors rather than divine and see where you get. And the consistency of treatment. Believers should do to their faith what they do to others' faith or belief. So do you want to be treated in the same way as you treat others? Well, maybe that should be some sort of a guide for how you conduct yourself. The author A.N. Wilson wrote a book on Jesus, A Life, in which he talks about Jesus being some Galilean holy man. In this death of Jesus, his brother James was mistaken for Jesus. Brother look alike, and word got around, and so people mistook James for Jesus, and the rest is church history. What about the sources for Jesus? Well, the Gospels, he said, are fictitious and not dispassionately written. In other words, they've got an agenda, those Gospel writers. They couldn't write objective history because they're actually devoted to Jesus. So how can you be fair-minded in writing about Jesus, the one whom you love and so forth? As though a Holocaust survivor couldn't write about what actually took place in a Nazi prison camp. Oh, you can't trust that concentration camp survivor. He's not writing dispassionately. Well, again, that may have very little to do with what actually took place in the concentration camp. You can write with passion and be accurate. Anyway, Jesus was not speaking in any lofty terms about himself, but Paul came on the scene and he invented Christianity. He took things in directions that Jesus never would have imagined. So that's his argument on Jesus and Christian argument. He talked about the problem of evil. He even read C.S. Lewis. And he says, I can remember almost yelling that reading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity made me a non-believer. I thought C.S. Lewis had some good arguments on the problem of evil. Of course, where do you get this standard of evil in the first place if there is no God? But again, he saw the world as a nasty, brutal place, and how could there be a merciful God in light of all of this that happens? On the idea of Christianity, he just found it to be nonsense, this new religion for Gentiles, establishing the church. He just talked about all of these things that he found troubling about the Christian faith. So he just finds that the Christian faith was just founded on all sorts of misrepresentations, misunderstandings, false assumptions, etc. Perfectly preposterous, he said. Well, here's another one, Anthony Kenny. I had the privilege of meeting Sir Anthony Kenny for lunch when I was in Oxford back at the end of January, and had a very good conversation. But he wrote this book, What I Believe. He's an agnostic, and he left the Catholic Church. He was studying for the priesthood, and he said, I could no longer continue as a teacher of doctrines and moral precepts about whose validity I was increasingly doubtful. He had to sign a statement that you have to believe that it's possible to demonstratively prove that God exists. And he said, well, that's too strong a position to take, but he had to sign it, so he declined to do so. And he gives reasons why he doesn't believe in God. He said that Thomas Aquinas' arguments don't work. He thought that if God foreknows the future, then human beings don't actually have free choice. I would say that God's foreknowledge is informed by what he knows we would do, so that it's not as though these are somehow opposed, but actually, if you will, God's foreknowledge is informed by what he knows we free creatures would do, so that there is genuine freedom. But he talks about the deleterious nature of faith. He doesn't think that faith is a virtue, that faith is blind in some way, and that you shouldn't follow this, you should follow reason and so forth, rather than taking this shortcut of faith. And also, he finds it incomprehensible that there should be such a notion as a disembodied being. All the persons we know about are embodied. Why should we say that there is a person that is disembodied? This just makes no sense. So that's Anthony Kenny and some of his argumentation. Here's another person who left the Christian faith. This is Bart Ehrman, the agnostic New Testament scholar and textual critic. He attended places like Moody Bible Institute, Wheaton College, Christian Liberal Arts University. Then he went to Princeton, where he studied under the noted textual scholar Bruce Metzger. And it was during this time at Princeton that his faith started to unravel. He had believed in inerrancy, and then as he went to Princeton Seminary, this started to change for him. He found that there are all sorts of textual challenges that he found in his own mind. And so these are some of his problems with the Christian faith. First, he says that some of these New Testament books were forged. They're written pseudonymously in the name of these various apostles. He also says that there is falsification going on, that the original manuscripts are different from the copies, and he makes this sound really dramatic, that the New Testament has 138,000 words, yet there are more changes or variants, 400,000 of them, changed by scribes from the original wording. So there are more changes than there are actual words in the New Testament. This sounds very dramatic, but evangelical, conservative Christian scholars know, who are involved in textual criticism, know this very well, and it's really over-dramatized because virtually all of these variations, should we talk about that our joy may be complete or that your joy may be complete? I mean, are you going to be part of that church that is the your joy may be complete church, or our joy may be complete church over on the other block? It's not as though we're going to start new denominations based on these slight variations, and we can know within about 0.5% what the originals actually said. So 99.4 to 6%, we can know what the original documents actually said, just following basic guidelines of textual criticism. But Bart Ehrman blows this out of proportion. But anyway, he talks about this. He talks about how Jesus became God in one of his books, that his followers really blew Jesus out of proportion and deified him beyond anything that Jesus himself would have recognized. And also he talks about the problem of evil, that the Bible fails to answer the problem of evil, etc. So those are some of the people who have left the Christian faith, and then the reasons that they have given for why they have left the Christian faith. But in general, what are some of the causes of deconversion? What prompts people to leave the Christian faith? And there's a book that a former professor of mine, Scott McKnight, wrote on this topic. And the first thing that came to, in his own study, the first issue that many people will cite for leaving, say, the Christian faith, is because it conflicts with science. Scott McKnight says, "In my research of stories of those who have abandoned the faith, the scientific evidence is the most common collision point. The issue is not only that Genesis 1 to 11 seems to conflict with science, but the explanatory power of empirical sciences and hypotheses. This seems to carry greater weight with them." By the way, if you're interested in looking at some of these issues, I've co-edited a book called A Dictionary of Christianity and Science, published by Zondervan, and it goes into a lot of these details if you want to look at the interface of science and the Christian faith. But here are some other ones that are listed besides science. Contradictions in Scripture, which goes against biblical inerrancy. Christian hypocrisy. Look at all those hypocrites out there. They call themselves Christian, but look at how they behave. The concept of hell, which we've talked about today and yesterday. Challenges from Scripture, difficulties, say, with the Old Testament. And we've touched on some of those things as well. Important questions to be talking about. One book, Leaving the Fold, talks about a lot of emotional reasons that people leave the faith. And I think it's important that we also note this, that in some congregations, in some denominations even, there can be a strong, quote, fundamentalist component where a lot of times high guilt-producing sermons or way of doing things, a culture of shame and so forth, that there could be a lot of emotional pain and trauma and a suppression of questions and doubts associated with the Christian faith or some fundamentalism. And so there can be that emotional component as well that has turned people off. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that as part of the picture that may go beyond any sort of intellectual issues that we're talking about. So that's something else to be concerned about. What about caricatures of deconversion? A lot of times people say, oh, those people deconverted, they left the Christian faith. Well, and they'll list a number of things that will kind of patch things up or explain things away. So Ruth Tucker, in her book Walking Away from Faith, she's an evangelical, she talks about, people leave because they're angry, that there's anger in deconversion, that they're rebellious, and a lot of times people leave under gut-wrenching circumstances, not because they prefer this. Arguments from persuasion. The deconverted can be argued back into the faith. Well, probably not as you may think, because many of them have been thinking about this, pulling themselves back, processing things, so it's not as though, some answers will jumpstart their pilgrimage back to the Christian faith. The assistance of Christian institutions, just send them to a Bible school, send them to a seminary, and their problems will be resolved. And that's not evidently so, she saes. The abandonment of morality. People abandon their faith so that they can go out and sin freely. And again, this isn't always the case. So we have to be careful about this. I mean, there are some who do indeed engage in questionable and immoral lifestyles. Richard Carrier, who's a noted atheist, engages in a polyamorous lifestyle. Left it. Basically rejected his wife and started to take up with other women in a kind of a free love, if you will, free sexual expression sort of relationship with anyone who comes along he finds appealing. Aldous Huxley talked about this in his own exploration of his own philosophy. He said, we wanted sexual liberation, and we could come up with a philosophy that basically gave us that permission to do so. So there may be personal motives and so forth, but we have to be careful not to override what those motives are and substitute those for reasons and evidence that we need to give to address the various challenges that people will raise. And some people say, oh, they weren't really Christians to begin with. And again, I don't know where your theology is on this matter, but I think in our conversation, we ought to give the benefit of the doubt to people who have come out of this. And maybe we can examine along the way, was that person really a Christian? Was that person really dedicated? Or did that person have just a misrepresentation or a caricature of the Christian faith and left under, for false reasons? They were really inadequate. Well, so again, this is part of the caricatures that we ought to avoid as we talk to people who have walked away from the Christian faith. Counters to deconversion. Counters to deconversion. What are the reasons for belief in God from atheists themselves? Those who have come out of atheism to the Christian faith. I think it's helpful for us to examine what they themselves say about this whole topic. What was it that drew them to the Christian faith? So we'll start to unpack this in just a moment. But Francis Bacon said, "A little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion." Let's first of all touch on what people deconvert to before we start to address these questions. Many deconversions are to a naturalistic understanding, and I've touched on this earlier on when Gary Habermas was here. I talked a little bit about this me-centered philosophy of naturalism, which, when it comes to metaphysics or the view of reality, that matter is all that there is. It's called materialism. And you've probably met a lot of people who will just say, well, we are simply nothing more than genes and hormones, molecules in motion. That's the metaphysic of materialism. Now, here's a word you may not be familiar with, but etiology, or it's a view of what causes something, like an etiology of a disease. What's the source or the cause of this disease? In the case of naturalism, all causes can be predicted by previous causes and effects, going all the way back to the Big Bang, if indeed the universe began to exist. Maybe it's always been here. Maybe matter is eternal. But that's determinism. And then finally, when it comes to epistemology, or the view of knowledge, knowledge is best or perhaps only acquired through the scientific method, what's called scientism. It's not to be scientific is different from being scientistic. Being scientific is fine, but being scientistic is to say that only science can give us knowledge. If you offer reasons from philosophy or theology or ethics or something like that, that's out of bounds, that's off limits. You need to be able to prove something scientifically. And of course, you can't scientifically prove that all knowledge must be scientifically provable. But what are the implications of naturalism? Well, there's no supernatural. There are no signs and wonders, no soul, no self-determination or free will, no survival after death, no significance to human beings, no solution to the problem of evil, ultimately. And I'll go through this very briefly. I've touched on this in an earlier talk that I gave here at Kensington Temple, but I find it very helpful to actually look at what naturalists, people who are atheists, say that actually reinforces belief in God. It's very nice to use these quotations and their observations to actually reinforce the strength of the case for God's existence. So we can say that in many ways the naturalists are declaring the glory of God because they're often borrowing from a theistic worldview. So let's look at these categories of why God makes more sense of the beginning of the fine-tuning of the universe and rationality and so forth. That there are certain features about our human experience as well as the universe around us that make excellent sense if God exists, but if God doesn't exist, these things are just kind of strange. They just don't fit with this materialistic, deterministic universe. And who we are as human persons. It just doesn't fit. So let's talk about the beginning of the universe. And again, I'll have to be very brief here as we're moving on. So we have people who acknowledge that the universe began to exist. Naturalists, atheists, I'm just going to be quoting them here. John Barrow and Joseph Silk talk about how our new picture of the universe is more akin to a traditional metaphysical picture of creation out of nothing. It predicts a definite beginning to events in time, indeed a definite beginning to time itself. And they ask, get this, they asked what preceded the event called the Big Bang? The answer to our question is simple: nothing. Something comes out of nothing. Well, thank you for saying that this looks a lot like the traditional picture of creation out of nothing. Genesis 1:1 has been saying this for a long time. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it took till the 20th century to have empirical confirmation of that ancient verse. William Rowe, an atheist, says, it must be acknowledged that the emergence of the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe has given new weight to an argument for the existence of some sort of creator. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Michael Ruse, atheist, philosopher of science, says this is a pretty remarkable state of affairs that we have here. Planets, suns, organisms, humans, and so forth. Why is there any of it? Why is there something rather than nothing? This question is not about the Big Bang or if anything went before. It is about the very fact of existence. One doesn't expect something like this, with its astounding interdependency and innumerable complex parts functioning in service of the whole, to just happen. Wow, what a great quotation. Thank you very much, Michael Ruse. You getting the idea here? They are helping to reinforce how God's existence makes sense of these things, but how God's non-existence leaves you with kind of scratching your head, wondering, how do I make sense of this? Why does anything exist at all? What about consciousness? We have one philosopher who says the emergence of consciousness then is a mystery, and one to which materialism signally fails to provide an answer. David Papineau, to this question of consciousness's origins, physicalists' theories of consciousness seem to provide no answer. On and on it goes. We can quote others. Colin McGinn talks about, how does consciousness spring forth from these molecules and motions? How did consciousness come about? Jaegwon Kim, how does conscious experience come into existence from these jostling electric currents and so forth? What about free will and moral responsibility? In this case, we take for granted humans have free will. We have moral responsibility. In our law courts, we don't say, Your Honor, my genes made me do it. I couldn't help it. No, we take personal responsibility seriously. But if naturalism is true, it's hard to square that with, with what we take for granted in everyday life. Thomas Nagel, an atheist, New York University, says there is no room for agency in a world of neural impulses, chemical reactions, and bone and muscle movements. Given naturalism, it's hard not to conclude that we're helpless and not responsible for our actions. Rationality, the fact that we can think, that we can reason, is a remarkable phenomenon. Here's Noam Chomsky, the linguist, who talks about, notice that it is just blind luck if the human science-forming capacity happens to yield the result that conforms more or less to the truth about the world. It is largely a lucky accident that there is such a partial convergence. So there's this world out there, and then our minds actually embrace or land on or grasp the truth of that reality. There's this correspondence between what goes on in our minds and the world out there. And Noam Chomsky says this is just blind luck that we can have this sort of a thing, what we call truth. That's just blind luck. Well, of course, is he telling us the truth, or is that just blind luck? We have to ask, I think. But notice how they're showing the implications of materialism, of molecules in motion shaping our brains so that we actually have no control over what is even produced by those molecules in motion. There is no self, there is no will, there is no soul. It's all just being pumped into us by forces over which we have no control. Rationality out the window because our beliefs have been produced by these non-rational forces. The philosopher Richard Rorty says much the same thing. Every speech, thought, theory, poem, composition, and philosophy will turn out to be completely predictable in purely naturalistic terms, which means what he just said is predictable in completely naturalistic terms. Notice what's going on here. In order to have knowledge, you have to have a belief that is true, but also warranted. It has to be a warranted, true belief. For the naturalist, the best you can get is a true belief, which isn't knowledge. I can walk past a store, and I can look at the clock in the window, and it says, oh, it's 2:15. And sure, there it is. That clock is working. Or maybe I don't even have a watch, and I go by and I say, oh, it's 2:15, and I go down into the tube, and the train is scheduled to arrive at 2:17, and bam, there it is. Wow, that clock must be right. I go back the next day at 5 o'clock in the evening, and it still says 2:15. Well, I happen to be lucky, so to speak, that I saw the clock having to register too, and I was able to catch the train, but it was just a true belief that was accidental. You see, accidental true beliefs don't count for knowledge. You have to have warrant to it. You have to have a basis for trusting that true belief which gives way to knowledge. So if you're just believing things that you happen to get lucky on, well, that's not knowledge. That's just a true belief that's accidental. But that's the implication of a naturalistic or materialistic worldview in which everything is determined by these forces over which we have no control. They're just producing beliefs in us, including what Richard Rorty has just said. He had no control over that. What about objective moral values? There is a recognition by many philosophers that if you have no God, Dostoevsky is right. Everything is permitted. There is no basis for objective moral values. So this philosopher, Joel Marx, says that he has given up on morality because morality suggests that God exists. And he says God doesn't exist, therefore morality can't exist. There are no objective moral values. So atheism, he says, implies a morality, being without morality. So we have these ongoing recognition. Kai Nielsen, philosopher in Canada, talks about how the picture that he paints of reason not being able to get you to morality, he says, is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. The point is this: pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. How do you move from the way things are to the way things ought to be? You can't do that given a naturalistic worldview. What about design and purpose in the universe and in biological organisms even? We have Stephen Hawking in the book The Grand Design talking about how if things were only slightly altered by modest amounts, the universe would be qualitatively different and, in most cases, unsuited for the development of life. Sounds like a good argument for God's existence here, doesn't it? If God exists, this sort of a finely tuned universe is highly probable. Without God's existence, this is just baffling. Okay, it happened, but wow, totally unpredictable, totally improbable. Francis Crick, when it comes to biological organisms, talks about how biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. The suppression of truth and unrighteousness here from Romans chapter 1. Keep reminding yourselves, tell yourself there's no designer, there's no designer, there's no designer. When it comes to the origin of life, he says it appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. Here Francis Crick is saying, here's the miraculous, near miraculous emergence of life. Wow, staggering. Well, thank you very much. That sounds a lot more like theism than naturalism. Every living cell would be the envy of any nanotechnologist, we read in the Scientific American. One philosopher of science talks about how biologists in nearly every area are hard-pressed to find language that does not impute purposiveness to living forms. the brain as a computer, or the cell as a factory, or the eye as a camera. We use this sort of design language as we talk about biological organisms, don't we? Even beauty in the universe. One philosopher, Anthony, here says that aesthetic, or the experience of beauty, aesthetic experience in this, our nature transcends our Darwinian origin in tantalizing ways. So there is this going beyond mere evolution to discovering something that seems to be almost transcendent. It goes beyond the natural world when we're dealing with beauty. Human uniqueness. Richard Dawkins talks about how we alone on earth, we have the power to defy the selfish genes of our birth. We alone on earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. Well, that sounds like human uniqueness here. Sounds like the image of God, that we're more than just material beings. We're able to rise above. Daniel Dennett, same sort of thing. We, unlike animals, have creeds and the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. This fact makes us different. Again, sounds like the image of God. Again, Anthony Kenny, and we'll quote an agnostic here. His reasons for not being an atheist are that the universe began to exist, that it began to exist. So this sounds very theistic. He also talks about how life originated. Again, kind of like Francis Crick, it's near miraculous that natural selection can't explain how there came to be such things as species at all. And even the origin of language. How do you account for the origin of language given a naturalistic universe? So I'll bypass this. I think Anthony Kenny does borrow very heavily from a biblical worldview, including belief in human dignity, free will, responsibility, rationality, human uniqueness, and so forth. But I'll leave that, I'll let that go here. Here's another consideration too, not just looking at the people who are naturalists themselves, who actually help make the case for God's existence, who help reinforce the strength of belief in God through their own admissions of the inadequacy of the naturalistic worldview, but also review some of the challenges of those who have walked away from the Christian faith. So let's take a look here at what people have actually said about why they left the Christian faith, and maybe take a second look to see, are these fair statements? Again, I don't want to diminish the integrity of those who have made these challenges, but I think we can actually push a little bit beyond some of them. So let's look at 5 key challenges. 1, let's look at the outsider test for faith that John Loftus proclaims. Well, one of the points that I'm making here is that a lot of outsiders are actually helping to make the case for the existence of God. These naturalists who are proclaiming the glory of God by admitting that naturalism itself doesn't have the resources to account for consciousness and free will and rationality and so forth. So here we have actually these naturalists acting as outsiders for us, telling us, you're on the right track. So it's also, we could add that the early church grew through a lot of outsiders coming in. And so we need to remember that furthermore, that the Christian faith is a knowledge tradition. Some people say, oh, that's just faith. The Christian faith says that if it is not knowledge, if you ought to reject it. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we ought to reject the Christian faith. That blind faith stuff is not what we are called to do. Paul was a realist. The biblical faith is proclaimed as a realist faith, that if something is out of touch, out of tune with reality, if it's false, we ought not to believe it, lest we be considered the most pitiable of people. Paul said, let's just eat, drink, and be merry. Also, we can add that there are plenty of scientists who profess belief in God who don't see their belief in opposition to it. John Loftus says we really need to take the scientific and the rational view. But what about those scientists who actually do embrace belief in God? Here's, and again, this brings us to the next challenge. What about the science and faith question? I think it's very interesting to note, and this is from America. I don't know what the demographics are like here, but the sociologist Elaine Howard Eklund of Rice University talks about how nearly 50% of U.S. academic scientists have traditional religious identities. That they don't see their own science as being at odds with their discipline. They may keep quiet. They usually don't have there's a silent presence. they're on campuses that they don't often speak up in faculty meetings or make maybe their faith public and talk about the compatibility of science and faith. But the statistics are there. In fact, I was speaking at a university in the United States, and I spoke with one woman who believed in intelligent design. And she said, I believe that the universe was finely tuned, that God is responsible for the fine-tuning of the universe and so forth. And she said, but I don't want to tell my dean about my view because I will not get tenure if that happens. So you hear these sorts of things as you go on university campuses, that people who are believers, if they speak too loudly before they get tenure, will be demoted. They will be fired for those kinds of beliefs. So again, just an example of what Elaine Howard Eklund is talking about. What about the problem of inerrancy? And I've touched on this before, the notion that the Bible is truthful in what it teaches or affirms. Well, as I said earlier, that inerrancy has been held by, is not held by every person who has been a proclaiming Christian or professing Christian. C.S. Lewis didn't take this view, but we certainly uphold him as someone who is a warm-hearted believer in Christ. And we're grateful for the work that he's done in defending the truth of the gospel. But it's better to give up on inerrancy than it is to give up on Jesus. And unfortunately, a lot of people think that this is the only choice that they have. It's either inerrancy or atheism. And they don't consider any other alternative. And so we need to be wise about instructing people. You may have doubts about the inerrancy, but the main thing is Jesus. Did Jesus rise from the dead? This is going to be critical. And so if Jesus rose from the dead, work your way from there to some of those other secondary issues. Even if there are genuine contradictions, this doesn't diminish the historical core of events that we read about, say, in the Gospels. Think of the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, where witnesses were divided about whether the ship broke in two or not before it sank. Just because people who were there on the scene didn't know, there's divided about what had happened, we certainly know that the Titanic sank, that event took place. And so if you get the details wrong, okay, but the main event certainly took place. What about the issue of, the question of seeing the scriptures as a holy book? A lot of people will approach the scriptures as, oh, this is a holy book, and they'll stay away from the scriptures because this is somehow religious and I don't go that route. As though what is said in the scriptures are somehow a deviation from history. I will tell people, just look at, and again, Gary Habermas makes this case. If you just have 1 Corinthians and Galatians, which are undisputed letters of Paul, don't treat them as a holy book, just treat them as historical documents. That you have actually contained within those two books very strong evidence for the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So even if you get rid of all of the books of the Bible and you just have those two letters written by what everyone takes to be Paul's authentic letters, you have a very strong case just in those two books for the historicity of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So maybe beginning there and again working your way back to the scriptures and how to understand them. What about the challenge of hypocrites in the church? Well, just because there are hypocrites in the church doesn't undermine what Jesus said about himself. A lot of people will look to Jesus and say, yeah, Jesus, great, but not his followers. But the point is that Jesus is indeed the authentic, the true, the genuine. And that those who depart from what Jesus proclaimed, those who deviate from that, should not be the measure by which we reject or accept Jesus. It is Jesus himself before whom we stand, not another believer or professing believer who falls short of the mark. Jesus himself said that people would do evil things in his name. So this idea of hypocrites, as hurtful, as difficult, as disappointing as this may be, that doesn't settle the issue about the truth. In fact, we can find, we can add this, we can find within any belief system all the hypocrites you want. But does that mean that we should believe anything? No. The question is what this person is saying, is this belief system, this worldview, true? That's what we ought to keep in mind. And so, is Jesus true? Is he genuine? Is he authentic? Is he the real thing, even apart from his followers? The problem of evil, we've talked about this today, so I won't say much, but I like G.K. Chesterton's quotation, where he says, when belief in God becomes difficult, the tendency is to turn away from him. But in heaven's name, to what? What are we going to turn to? As Peter said in John chapter 6, Lord, to whom else shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. You get rid of Jesus, you get rid of God, the problem of evil only becomes worse. Is it a difficulty? Sure it is. Let's not diminish that. But every worldview, as we said, has to grapple with this problem. It's not just a Christian problem. We've talked about C.S. Lewis, so I'll just move beyond that. Interestingly, here's A.N. Wilson. Reasons that he found his way back to the Christian faith on this problem of evil. He says, we quoted him earlier as someone who rejected the Christian faith as an atheist, but he actually came back to the Christian faith, and it was watching a whole cluster of friends and my own mother die over quite a short space of time convinced me that purely materialist explanations for our mysterious human existence simply won't do on an intellectual level. He knew there was something more to our existence than just mere molecules in motion, just organisms passing off the scene. Which brings me now to counterparts to deconversion, how people who left the Christian faith have come back, or people who have just gravitated to the Christian faith out of their atheism. And I like this quotation from Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger when asked, how many ways are there to God? Now, we already talked about Jesus being the only way. That's not what we're talking about here. But how many different ways can a person find God in Jesus Christ? And he says, as many ways as there are people. Colin was just talking about this. So it was nice to have this in the PowerPoint presentation to again offer some confirmation on this, that people have a personal pathway of finding God, of finding their way to God by the assistance of the Holy Spirit. And so people's pathways may be different. And so what I want to do is offer some different ways in which people come to faith. I think we can talk about one, the aesthetic and the literary. We can talk about the philosophical and scientific. We can talk about the re-enchantment of the world. We can talk about the Christian community. We can even talk about, and I didn't add this in the outline here, but talk about how of the impact of the gospel in history, and we'll talk about that in the next section, and then the powerful figure of the historical Jesus. So let me just go through a few of these, and then we'll wrap up in the next 7-8 minutes or so, and then we'll come to your questions. But here's an emphasis on people who have come to faith through the aesthetic, the beautiful, through the literary. Holly Ordway, a former atheist, teaches at Houston Baptist University now, says, I found that my favorite authors were men and women of deep Christian faith, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien above all, and then the poets, Gerard Manley Hopkins, George Herbert, John Donne, and others. Their work was unsettling to my atheist convictions. C.S. Lewis talked about in reading G.K. Chesterton and George MacDonald, I did not know what I was letting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. God is, if I may say it, very unscrupulous. Louise Cowan, she herself taught literature at University of Dallas, and she herself turned away from the rationalism, from theology books, even reading the Bible. That didn't really do anything for her, but she says she had been expecting a logical proof of something one was intended to recognize. What was needed was a way of seeing. Notice that, a way of seeing. I had to be transformed in the way that literature transforms by story, image, symbol, before I could see the simple truths of the gospel. She says, above all else, this seems to me the chief value of what we call the classics. They summon us to belief. They seize our imaginations and make us commit ourselves to the self-evident, which we have forgotten how to recognize. Even for the things ordinarily considered certain, we moderns require proof. In this state of abstraction, we are cut off from the fullness of reality. Something has to reach into our hearts and impel us toward recognition. A scientific textbook, very interesting, but those classics, they show you who you really are as a human being. They deepen us as human beings. They go beyond what mere science can do. Philosophical and scientific supports for God's existence, another pathway to people working their way back to God. Edward Fazer, who says, speaking for myself anyway, I can say this much. When I was an undergrad, I came across the saying that learning a little philosophy leads you away from God, but learning a lot of philosophy leads you back, as we just quoted Francis Bacon. As a young man who had learned a little philosophy, I scoffed, but in later years, at least in my own case, I would come to see that it's true. Anthony Flew taught at the University of Reading here in England. He talked about believing, following this dictum of following the evidence wherever it leads. And recent scientific discoveries prompted him to recognize that there is a God through the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the complexity of biological life. Somebody I know, Darren Raspberry, I knew him when he was an atheist. And he said, a few years later, after we had met in 2008, he said, sometime last week, this is in 2011, I realized that I could no longer call myself a skeptic. After 15 years away from Christianity, most of which I was spent as an atheist with an active, busy intent on destroying the faith, I returned to a church with a real intention of going for worship last Sunday. So he came, why? It was really through a lot of apologetics arguments that he found that a lot of the atheists that he had engaged with, not to question their integrity, but he just didn't find their answers satisfying. So it was the lack of explanatory power within atheism that led him to belief in God. So again, I'm just kind of have to move here quickly. Alistair McGrath, a former atheist, he said, atheism, I began to realize, rested on less than satisfactory evidential basis. The arguments that had once seemed bold, decisive, and conclusive increasingly turned out to be circular, tentative, and uncertain. Here's someone with, again, a doctorate in molecular biophysics as well as theology. The re-enchantment of the world, we were just talking about this at lunch, of how the Christian faith can help to re-enchant a world that has become disenchanted due to a mechanistic, depersonalized, materialistic universe. And so that's what C.S. Lewis was about. He came to see through imagination, through belief in the reality of common sense about, yeah, I've got moral duties. Yeah, we can think, we can know. We're not just molecules in motion. Yeah, other minds exist and so forth. These are fundamental facts of reality. But he said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun is risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. The Christian faith brought light and illumination where it was otherwise dark. And G.K. Chesterton, who had himself been an agnostic, found the atheists and the skeptics guilty of an insane simplicity. And again, this whole idea of disenchantment. The universe had been interpreted through a merely scientific lens, strips away our humanity, strips away our rationality, our free will, our imagination. We're just reduced to molecules in motion. But G.K. Chesterton said he knew better than that. He knew who we are as human beings, that the scientific understanding of things did not describe who we are. He says we put on a theory like a magic hat and history becomes translucent like a house of glass. He talked about how people are returning to the Christian faith. Why? Because they see that it brings illumination, it brings light. A.N. Wilson, again, became a believer, and he says the reality of language and love and so forth and music point him to the fact that we are more than mere collections of meat. They convince me that we are spiritual beings and that the religion of the incarnation, Christian faith, asserting that God made humanity his image and continually restores humanity his image, is simply true. The community of Christians, we can talk about how the community of faith can actually help reinforce the reality of the gospel rather than just living as individualists and kind of fumbling our way through, that the traditions, the community, the love that is there also reinforces the reality of the gospel. William Alston tells about how he came to faith in Christ through the community of the church that led to his own awareness of spiritual realities that he just didn't see earlier on in his life in the church. And so basically William Alston, this noted philosopher, he said that in the last analysis, quoting G.K. Chesterton, the reason why I'm a Christian is that the church is a living and not a dead teacher. That pretty much sums it up for me. I'm a Christian because it was in the Christian church that I came to discover the presence and activity of God in my life. We'll talk about this a little later, so I'm just going to skip this for now, but the impact of the Christian faith in history is another powerful component. As I speak about this topic on university campuses, people really listen because they see that the Christian faith has made a difference in history. It has had an impact when faithful Christians live out the gospel in transformed ways that brings about the many goods that we experience, like democracy and literacy for all, public education, mass education, and so forth. We'll talk about that a little later, but these are some of the realities of how the Christian faith has actually made an impact in history. And then we can talk about the powerful figure of the historical Jesus. And we can, I'll skip past this here. But the New Testament scholar Michael Bird tells of his own story, and with this I'll wrap up. Remember we talked about Bart Ehrman earlier on. Well, Bart Ehrman, he says about this, Bart Ehrman's narrative suggests that the more educated you are, the less likely you are to believe. My life proves otherwise. I've got my own deconversion story to match his. He says, some have great confidence in skeptical scholarship, and I once did, perhaps more than anyone else. If anyone thinks they're assured in their unbelief, I was more committed. Born of unbelieving parents, never baptized or dedicated, on scholarly credentials, a PhD from a secular university. As to zeal, mocking the church. As to ideological righteousness, totally radicalized. But whatever intellectual superiority I thought I had over Christians, I now count it as sheer ignorance. Indeed, I count everything in my former life as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing the historical Jesus, who is also the risen Lord. For his sake, I've given up trying to be a hipster atheist. I consider that old chestnut pure filth in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a CV that will gain me tenure at an Ivy League school, but knowing that I've bound myself to Jesus, and where he is, there I shall also be. Yeah, go ahead, clap. That's it. As he tells of his story, he says, many years later, I read the New Testament for myself. The Jesus I encountered was far different from the deluded, radical, even mythical character described to me. This Jesus, the Jesus of history, was real. He touched upon things that cut close to my heart, especially as I pondered the meaning of human existence. I was struck by the early church's testimony to Jesus. In Christ's death, God has vanquished evil, and by his resurrection, he has brought life and hope to all. When I crossed from unbelief to belief, all the pieces suddenly began to fit together. I had always felt a strange unease about my disbelief. I had an acute suspicion that there might be something more, something transcendent. But I also knew that I was told not to think that. I knew that ethics was nothing more than aesthetics, a mere word game for things I liked and disliked. I felt conflicted when my heart ached over the injustice and cruelty in the world, kind of like C.S. Lewis. He says, faith grew from seeds of doubt, and I came upon a whole new world that for the first time actually made sense to me. To this day, I do not find faith stifling or constricting. Rather, faith has been liberating and transformative for me. It has opened a constellation of meaning, beauty, hope, and life that I had been indoctrinated to deny. And so began a lifelong quest to know, study, and teach about the one whom Christians call Lord. Amen. Nothing more to say after that.